Welcome to the show. Great to meet up with Eric Peters as I do each week. And Eric, first of all, let me ask, how are you today?
Well, I'm cold, but other than that, I should start a fire, but I'm too lazy to do it. So I'm sitting here in my hoodie and I've got a boiling hot cup of coffee to try to keep my hands warm. But I'll do my best to not chatter my teeth while we talk.
I almost went with a hoodie this morning because where I am, it's cold as well. So, who knew? Having to deal
It's
with this
winter.
global warming and climate change, or is that still a thing? I haven't.
Well, the climate does change, at least locally. We've had this weird seesawing. It was literally 65, almost 70 degrees a day or so ago. And according to the local weather, it's going to go down to 13 by Thursday.
Woo, okay, that's some pretty serious winter type weather. So, let's talk a little bit about what's happening in the nation. Things, of course, heating up in Minnesota, and I got to tell you, Eric, I'm torn in the sense that I know most attention is focused on the woman who was shot, interfering with ICE operations, and I think reasonable people can agree that could have been avoided on a number of different fronts, but the fraud that is being uncovered there too. I mean, on the one hand, there is a level of fraud that I'm like, yeah, they need to address that.
Mhm.
Sending, swarms of federal agents, I think 2,000, maybe 3,000 at last count, to Minnesota to do that. It seems to me that could have some unintended consequences. Case in
One of the
point, you know,
Yeah, one of the immensely frustrating things about the events that have played out over the last couple of days is that this incident involving that ICE guy and the woman who was shot to death are now going to efface the corruption scandal in Minnesota. People aren't going to be talking about that. It's a godsend to Tim Walz that happened. That this stupid thing that didn't have to happen did happen. They're trying to, and this is just my personal opinion here. They're trying to frame this lefty Karen as some kind of a dangerous person. She was just a harpy. They knew she wasn't a felon. It's ridiculous. Okay, they had her license plate. Why not just let her go to her house later, arrest her for disorderly conduct, blocking traffic, whatever. That guy didn't have to step out in front of the car, and he certainly didn't have to shoot her to death. That's my opinion. So, now we've got this poo storm as a result of that, as a result of stupid actions on the part of the Karen, homicidal actions on the part of the ICE guy, in my opinion. And Americans, all the while this is going on, are being habituated to the presence of SEAL team operators on the streets, grabbing people. This is not civilian law enforcement. This is sort of like a military occupation with the same kinds of tactics that are being deployed on American citizens. Whatever you think about the illegal alien thing, just having vehicles roll up on somebody on the street and just guys jumping out and grabbing people and taking them to God only knows where. If it could happen to them, it could happen to us too. This isn't the right way to handle the situation, in my opinion.
I think that a lot of people would do well to ask themselves and be honest with themselves. If it were Joe Biden's White House, or we'll take it one step further, if it were Kamala Harris's White House that was doing these kinds of raids, would you still be all full throated in that support for these officers and they're upholding the law and they're just doing their jobs, or would you have a slightly different take? And
Well said. Well said. I mean, think about how people on the Red Hat side are appalled by what happened to Ashley Babbitt back in the January, riots. Uh, Understandably, I think it was excessive force that was used against her. She maybe have behaved stupidly, but she was just a woman, being a little rowdy. Shooting her was a bit much. Just as I think shooting this woman was a bit much. But the unction is very selective. And you and I were talking a little bit about this off the air, and it seems as if everybody is just queued up to be triggered according to their ideological point of view, not according to, well, what actually happened here. Let's look at this from a principle point of view, not an ideological point of view. Not, well, I'm a Republican, so I have to have this reaction, or
right.
I'm a Democrat, so I have to have this programmed reaction.
Yeah, it's like people are waiting for the talking points to be handed to them. And look, I was guilty of this for many years as a talk radio host. I would throw the red meat and people loved it. We reveled in, this feeding frenzy of who and what we're against. And it's just my opinion here, but enemy driven thinking is what's causing this divide on both sides. It's not just the left. There's a lot of enemy driven thinking on the right. And at the risk of being unpopular for pointing that out, I'm going to suggest that if you're troubled or if you're weighed down by all the negativity and anger that seems to drive every conversation today, maybe consider whether or not that's what's driving your thinking.
100%. I find myself having to check myself sometimes because there's this, we tend to react in an emotional way sometimes to a situation that's put in front of us. It's important to try to not do that and to think about it and to breathe and to not behave like a chimp at the zoo, like you and I were talking about a little while ago.
And one of the symptoms, and I think you accurately identified this when we were talking before we went on the air. I find, there's things that I want to say, and there's a right and profanity wants to assert itself.
Sure.
And I'm like, wow, where did that come from? I don't just sprinkle my everyday conversation with that. It's something that I feel strongly about. But why is it making me feel strongly? Is it the way that the headline was written? Is it the way that it was reported? Is it just my own tribalism? And like you said, we have to check ourselves. And the only thing I'm going to offer here in terms of, if you want, if like me, you want to try to keep that under control, it's helpful to focus on what is sacred to me. What do I love? And let my actions and my speech and everything else portray that more so than here's who I'm against and here's what I'm against.
Amen. Amen. 100%. You want to talk about some good news?
Tell me some good news.
Okay, well, Stellantis, which is the parent company of the Jeep, Ram, Truck, Chrysler, and Dodge brands, has announced they're pulling the plug, literally, on all of their plug-in hybrid models because while they can be made to make them by the federal government in order to comply with federal regulations, nobody's compelled to buy them. So these things have been stacking up on dealers' lots. If you drive by any Jeep store, you'll see them, rows of these things. And no wonder. The Wrangler 4xe, which is the plug-in hybrid version of the Jeep Wrangler, is $20,000 more expensive than the standard Wrangler. So you've got two problems here. The problem one being, are people willing to pay that much more for a plug-in hybrid? And B, can they? How many people are in the position of wanting it and are able to? And the answer is not very many. So they're walking that back. And this is an example of one of the things that Trump has done that's good. The reason that Stellantis is able to pull the plug is because Trump did dial back the federal regulations that have been pushing these vehicles on the market for the past 3 years. If you may have noticed that practically every new vehicle on the market now is some kind of hybrid. And the reason for that is the manufacturers were anticipating a federal 50 mile per gallon mandatory minimum standard that all the vehicle manufacturers would have to comply with. The only way they could do that was to throw in a lot of electric cars and a lot of partially electric cars, which is what hybrids are. Now that that's gone, they're left with all this glut of machinery that they can't sell. But the one thing that they can do that's rational is to cut bait. And that's what Stellantis is doing. But who pays for this ultimately? This represents probably billions of dollars in losses to Stellantis. General Motors posted, I think, a $7 billion loss on their EVs. Ford admits they've lost $20 billion on the EV thing. It's just absolutely catastrophic.
Well, and you and I talked about this. I believe we may have talked about this maybe a couple of winters ago, but EVs especially are a hard sell in the winter when, as you had pointed out, you lose charge just with it sitting there in the cold.
Right. And the real issue there, as I see it, isn't even so much that you lose charge. It's the difficulty and the time cost of recovering charge. If you could recharge an electric vehicle in the same amount of time that it takes to refuel a gas engine car, I don't think it would really matter if an EV could only go 150 miles. I mean, I've driven some seriously gas hoggy vehicles over the years. I had a Hellcat Charger when they were still making those with the supercharged 700 horsepower Hemi V8, and you can absolutely
Mm.
drain the tank of one of those things in about 170 miles. Who cares? You can just pull up to the next closest gas station and fill the tank and be back on your way. But with an EV, best case scenario is if you happen to find one of these so-called fast chargers, and they're not that common. So you happen to get there in time, you're going to be sitting there for at least 20 to 30 minutes to get a partial charge. Really important. They never tell you about the partial charge thing, because in order to prevent a fire and in order to prevent hurting the battery, the thing wicks down after a certain point. If you want a full charge, you're going to be sitting there for an hour and a half. It's unacceptable. Nobody's going to put up with that, particularly people who have money. Like the main perk of having money is that you don't have to put up with things. The idea that a rich person is going to sit at a Sheets for a half hour while the guy he sees over there in the clapped out old truck, that's me, he fills up his tank and is off and on his way after 3 minutes. He's not going to put up with it.
No, I'm with you there. I've tried. to like EVs. I've tried to be impressed when friends get one, and hey, yeah, that's got some really cool features. But you couldn't put a gun to my head and make me buy one based
Yeah.
on what I know, and a lot of that comes from our conversations and you pointing out that you know if you want one, great, get one, but this whole idea that it had to be mandated and well, you have to meet these clean air standards and this and that, it just sounds like it's setting us up for another huge federal bailout of the automotive industry.
Yeah, well, it had to be mandated because it couldn't succeed on the merits.
Yep.
They did their very best to dodge and weave and to point out, well, look how quick it is. It can get to 60 in 3 seconds, and you won't have to go to a gas station anymore, and all of these other things. But the truth leaked out. As they began to get into circulation and reports started to filter through the mainstream media curtain, wherein Oz hides. People recognized, oh my gosh, that means I'm going to have to plan my life around this stupid car and how long it's going to take me to put charge in it. It's just not acceptable. That's the bottom line. If these things were on par, let alone better than the existing cars, you wouldn't need mandates. They would sell on their own, right? I mean, if they
Oh,
cost less,
absolutely.
they were more convenient. You wouldn't need a mandate. People go, yeah, that's for me. I like that. That's a better way of doing things. But the fact is, they're a worse and more expensive way of doing things. Leaving aside all of the political, ideological stuff about climate change, at the end of the day, people have to live their lives, and most people aren't going to willingly buy into more hassle and more cost.
Here, here. Let's talk for a moment to just touch on geopolitics. It appears we've entered the age of might makes right. If we want it, we'll take it.
Mm-hmm.
Your thoughts on the new doctrine? What is it? The Don Roe doctrine?
On-road doctrine, which isn't even that, because what we're doing is projecting power globally, not minding our own business in our own backyards. The stuff that makes your head swivel, at least for me, is that, my God, it was like only about a year ago we were talking about focusing on America, focusing on internal things, making this country great again. And now it might as well have elected Dick Cheney, drag his corpse out and put him in the White House. We're bombing countries left and right, talking about regime change again, occupying. What are we going to do in Venezuela? Erect a puppet government there? And this is a huge country. It was difficult enough to try to keep control of Iraq and Afghanistan. Now they're going to try to keep control of Venezuela. How much is that going to cost Americans to make the world safe for Chevron? So that they can extract natural resources from that country. And God only knows what the Chinese are going to do in response to this, because it's a threat to them and their national security interests to cut off their oil. That led to a war 80 years ago when we cut off the Japanese supply of oil. And then there's this awfulness in the Middle East, which is just so obviously contrived. Trump announces, we'll back the Iranian protesters if the government shoots, and just as if on cue, the protests start to happen, right? And I hope that this thing doesn't percolate and boil over, because I suspect that the Iranians are ready for it and that they probably have the capacity to hit back in a meaningful way. And who benefits from that? Well, maybe Greater Israel benefits from it, but not if things go really south, which they absolutely could. I don't understand what America's interests are in this. And then we've got the Russian situation, for crying out loud, on
Yep.
top of that. And old Vlad sent a message, a Sicilian message via the Oreshniks last week. Again, it's not been covered much in the American media, but he used his Oreshnik missiles to cripple the energy grid around Lvov and Kyiv. And so now half the population of these places has no electricity and no heat. And that's lethal potentially for these people.
Oh,
And
yeah.
implicit in what he did, because these Oreshnik strikes happen pretty close to the border with Poland. Hint, hint, keep pushing us, and we're gonna hit back. And again, how does this benefit us? And what are we doing? We're propping up Vladimir Zelensky, who's just announced his intention to basically be dictator for life again. He's the president, like Idi Amin was the president of Uganda. Why are we supporting this guy?
Yeah, I I am so disgusted with our own government right now, just based on the amount of fraud and corruption and fleecing of the taxpayers, and then shuttling that money to non-governmental organizations and friends, fellow travelers that will sit there and use it for subversive causes. Um, I think it was Marjorie Taylor Greene. I don't know if she has. I don't know if she has fully resigned, but she's leaving Congress, and she's talking about it's time for people to stop paying their taxes. Fill out your W-4 and just say withhold nothing, and see
I'm
where that
glad you
goes.
brought her up. And I think that would be such an effective strategy if enough of us did it. Now, the difficulty is, who wants to be the first guy to jump out of the trenches, right? And
Yep.
So that's where we're at. But it's going to take people doing that. Starve the beast. It's the only thing that they understand. And it's a legitimate question to ask. What are we getting? We typically, the average guy is paying what, 28%, I think, something like that, federal taxes. What do you get in return for that? Kiev? This stuff in Venezuela, it's of no benefit to us, which it's supposed to be. The whole underlying principle, so they say, of us paying taxes is that we get a government that serves our interests, as opposed to the interests of foreign governments and NGOs and all of these connected people who are profiteering off of the money that we work hard for and we need.
No, I'm with you there. It's, you know, I think who was it? Henry David Thoreau had the right idea, when he moved out to Walden, and just, how little can I need to still be happy? And frankly, the older I get, and frankly, the more complicated government tries to make my life, I start to realize, yeah, I really don't need that much. I just need a little room to breathe, and would like to see a little justice once in a while, if that's not going to cramp anybody's style.
There's great wisdom in that, but at the same time, I also think that we shouldn't have to enserf ourselves and live in a shack in order to starve the beast, in order to end this stuff. We should be able to enjoy a reasonably prosperous life if we work hard and earn money that we earned. It's ours to be able to spend on ourselves and our families and the things that are matter to us, not on the things that matter to some politician in DC who thinks it's important that we send another $1 billion to whatever country halfway across the world somewhere. So, boy, I really hope that Marjorie Taylor Greene's idea gains traction, because if it did, and if it started to really get going, it would take on a force, I think, that would be unstoppable. And we could actually have a productive, real revolution, not in the armed clash sense, but in a profound change sense. And we badly need that.
Honest to goodness, I really feel like with what's happening in Minnesota, particularly the outrage that's being spun up and the protests that have followed, the shooting of this lady in the minivan. I feel like the curtains being peeled back from the corruption to such an extent that the left, among others, those who have that vested interest in the state, they need a major distraction. If that's bloodshed in the streets, great, great. Like you were saying earlier, that it took our attention away from a lot of the fraud in Minnesota, because everybody's talking about this woman and the ICE officer who shot her. Um, I think they're pulling out the big cards. Maybe global war will be the biggest one of all, to try to keep us from seeing how badly we've been screwed over.
Well, and the same applies to the right, frankly. Nothing would benefit Donald Trump more right now than a war or some type of serious civil unrest, which he could then use as the pretext for, I don't know, martial law, declaring an emergency, whatever, to take people's minds off the fact that no, inflation has not been tamed. It still costs stupid money to buy a couple of bags of groceries. It is still difficult for most Americans to provide for their basic necessities at this point. And by the way, whatever happened to the Epstein business? It's all off the radar. All of the
Right.
stuff that we voted for is off the radar now. And instead, we're all talking about what's going on in Minnesota and what's going on in Venezuela and in Ukraine and in the Middle East.
Yep. It's I guess yeah, at the risk of telling people, turn off the dang TV, put your phone down, but really, if you're consuming a steady diet of what's being beamed to you by mass media, whether it's left wing, right wing, or somewhere in between, the chances are you're letting someone or something else shape your worldview in ways that you probably don't even suspect. I know that the phrase "touch grass" is probably out
Yeah.
of style now, but um, disconnecting from that digital feed of information is very healthy and needs to be done on a semi-regular basis if you want to maintain your sanity.
Yeah, or turn a wrench. I'm in the midst of this project where I'm converting my old Trans Am to a manual transmission.
Bring us up to speed. You sent me some pictures over the last few days of some really nice, shiny new parts.
Yep.
So where are you on this project?
Well, I've just finished installing most of the hardware that actuates the clutch mechanism. On these old cars, when you pushed on the clutch, you were actually pushing on a rod. That rod went through the firewall, and that in turn operated a lever. It's really quite clever when you look at it. It's not like a modern car that has a hydraulic circuit, and it's very different. So it's just it's something you can get your hands on. It's really cool to see how the little bits and pieces all fit together and work. So I've got that done. Yesterday, the UPS man dropped off my brand new shiny flywheel. The flywheel, of course, bolts to the back of the engine, and I'm going to try to get that on this afternoon, time willing. Then the next thing, funds willing, is to get the clutch and the pressure plate and the bell housing and put those things on. And then the very last thing, the pièce de résistance, as they say, is the actual Super T10 Borg Warner 4-speed manual that goes in with the Hurst shifter that sticks up through the drive shaft tunnel. So I hope to have it all put together by late spring, money permitting.
Wow. Well, you're taking photographs and hopefully some
Oh
video
yeah,
of this as you do it.
oh yeah, I'm actually doing installments on EP Autos, so people
Oh,
can follow this. There's actually been a great deal of interest in this, and I think not necessarily because there are a lot of people out there who want to do it. I think it's just getting back to what we were talking about, hands-on, real stuff, fun stuff, not all this dreary, depressing political stuff.
productive stuff.
Yeah, productive stuff, exactly.
That's a great note to end today's conversation on. And for those who want to check it out for yourself, I'll have a link to Eric's website in today's show notes, which you can find at thebryanhydeshow.com. Eric, feel like this has been a productive therapy session for me. I
Hey,
thank you
Matt,
for ministering to me and likewise to my listeners.
absolutely, absolutely. Now it's time for more hot coffee.
All right, we'll catch you next week.
Thank you.